Welcome and thank you for joining us for the launch of the Good Cyber Stories initiative. My name is Patrick Pawlak and I work for the EU Institute for Security Studies, but I'm also a project coordinator for the EU Cyber Direct, a project that is responsible for the implementation of this initiative. Good Cyber Stories is an initiative and a project launched together by a group of 10 actors: Australia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Estonia, France, Ghana, Mexico, United Kingdom, and the European Union. And it was launched to remind us all about the positive impact that the internet has on our lives and the role it plays in finding solutions to global problems such as climate change, migration, inequalities, and the global pandemics. We have chosen Paris Peace Forum for a single reason: its commitment to solving global challenges through international cooperation and collective action. Collaboration between states, civil society organizations, and the private sector is also at the core of the Good Cyber Stories initiative. But Paris Peace Forum is also about space for solutions, debates, and innovation. And to make sure that we don't disappoint our viewers, you, and the organizers, we have invited 3 excellent experts and leaders in their communities to explore with us how to stimulate concrete actions for peace and trust in cyberspace. Fitri Bintang Timur is a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia, where she works on cybersecurity projects. Her research focuses on cybersecurity, peace and mediation, as well as the role of women in peace and security. Marietje Schaake is International Policy Director at the Stanford University Cyber Policy Center and the President of the Cyber Peace Institute. As a former politician and now an academic and commentator, she is known for her thought-provoking ideas and even more so for concrete actions that usually follow, including during her term at the European Parliament. Last but not least, Samir Saran, President of the Observer Research Foundation. Samir is definitely known as a man of action, although he has also many interesting things to say. He curates the Resina Dialogue, India's annual flagship platform for geopolitics and geoeconomics, and chairs Sci-Fi, India's annual conference on cybersecurity and internet governance. He also sits on the board of Digital Peace Now initiative. So what is Good Cyber Stories initiative and why did these 10 actors decide to launch it? Hopefully this short video will show you and give you a better idea.
Every day, people all over the world benefit from the positive impact of the internet.
I can work online from any place I want.
So I use internet to buy things.
To take online courses.
To keep in touch with my friends and family.
However, the benefits of free, open, safe, and secure cyberspace are often overshadowed by the narrative that focuses on the conflict, risks, and vulnerabilities that come with the digital age. But there is another side to the story. The Good Cyber Stories initiative aims to give voices to projects that have real positive impact on our lives and change society for the better. From small victories to policies that impact the lives of millions, Good Cyber Stories are initiatives that inspire. Whether it's closing the gender gap in cyberspace, building capacities to fight cybercrime and disinformation, or protecting communities facing discrimination, the Good Cyber Stories initiative provides an opportunity for policymakers and project managers to learn from each other and to progress collectively. The Good Cyber Stories are initiatives that enhance state capacities and societal resilience in cyberspace. But there are many more initiatives that improve our lives. They deserve to be in the spotlight too. Join the Good Cyber Stories initiative and tell your story.
From small victories to policies that impact the lives of millions, Good Cyber Stories initiative, as you could have heard, aims to put in the spotlight initiatives that inspired. It also provides an opportunity for policymakers and project managers to learn from each other and progress collectively. But how do we get from words to actions, which is also the title of this session? And our panelists have at least one thing in common. They are all great with words, but they are even better in action. So let's begin. I'll kick off this discussion with a question to Fitri, who is also one of the recipients and fellows of Women in Cyber Fellowship that we have identified as a Good Cyber Story for 2020. It focuses on closing the gap in women's participation in international security debates. So Fitri, I would like to ask you at the more micro level, how important it is that projects like this receive additional visibility and are promoted more broadly internationally. What was the immediate impact of Women in Cyber Fellowship on your life and work? And what is the broader impact of the project in your view?
Thank you, Patrick. Let me maybe start with a general observation. We often take the freedoms to speak and express our thought through words for granted. However, this is not always the case. While some people belittle the value of dialogue and conversation as just talk shop, we need to keep in mind that for many people around the world, participation in such conversation is difficult, if it's not impossible. This is, for instance, the case for women participation in cyber discussion. According to UNIDO data, the number of women participating in cyber norm discussion at the first UN group of government experts in 2004 was only 10%. Today, this number has increased to 40% in the ongoing UNGGE. Meanwhile, at the UN Open-Ended Working Group that has been ongoing for this past 2 years, the number of women delegation participating is 32%, but only 24% leading as head of delegation. That said, Women in Cyber Fellowship is actually a great example of how to make concrete action that are often essential in order to empower people to speak and make their words more powerful. I am myself honored and humbled to have received the Women in Cyber Fellowship and participate actively in the UN debates on cyber issue. The opportunities allowed me to meet, learn, network, and share thoughts with other people and learning from across the world their effort in making the internet safer, more useful, and peaceful. So thank you for the sponsor of this initiative, Australia, United Kingdom, Canada, Netherlands, and New Zealand, that I can also participate in the open-ended working group in New York. But let me give you a concrete example of why and how the relationship between words and action matters. The immediate impact of this cyber fellowship for women for me is that I gain better understanding on the gender differentiated impact on cyber operation and incident. Indonesia is currently drafting the second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And as part of the civil society counterpart, drafter, and public discussion online moderator, I managed to include the concern of new technology and information security in the draft plan. Women usually do not enjoy equal access to information and communication technology. And it's true in Indonesia, where pre-COVID, only 40% of women are able to access internet through their mobile phone, compared to 50 plus maybe 60% of men, due to economic power disparity. But this number has changed due to COVID, because it closed the nation's school and forced women's role as a child educator at home. This pushes women to seek information online. But aside from this disparity and discrimination, women also face specific gender-based violence and barriers to meaningful access. This year's statistic from Indonesian National Commission on Violence Against Women recorded the increasing trend of gender-based violence with 300% rise compared to 2 years ago, and the range of form of cyber security threat to women, including intimidation, revenge porn, doxing, to hacking. This is why I think in the broader impact, it is important to highlight the synergy of cybersecurity with national, even regional, in my case, ASEAN-wide, Southeast Asian level, regional action plan on women, peace, and security. This year is 20 years commemoration of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and I think it is the most fitting if we make Women, Peace and Security Resolution relevant with infotech development. It is also beneficial to address the gap of women participation in cyber with the Sustainable Development Goals number 5, gender equality and women empowerment. I thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Fitri. I like the fact that you kind of pushed the words back in my own mouth when we implied in the title as well, from words to action, that words are bad. But I think actually what your intervention makes it very clear is that actually words sometimes, something that we take very much for granted, as you said, the freedom of expression and to participate in the talk shops, as we sometimes describe these processes, is not something that is really that common and taken for granted by many people around the world. So I think your intervention is very useful in showing us actually that actions can be important in order to empower people to use words and make words a powerful instrument. I think a point taken, and I think in the future, when we think about from words to actions, we'll also have to think about the reverse direction of this conversation. Samir, I will jump to you right now, if you don't mind, because I think you can give us a slightly different perspective. When we talk about women in cyber, we look a bit more at the macro level, and with Fitri's example, we looked at the concrete impact on an individual. With you, I would like to touch upon some of those big international processes that are taking place between the governments, but also some of those track 1.5 and track 2 processes that you, through ORF, has been involved in over the past years. And I would like to ask you maybe about your assessment of those conversations, be it through membership as a commissioner in the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, for instance, where Marietje was also a member, so she might want to share some experiences there. But I think what I would like to hear from you is what is really the assessment of those processes? You know, again, as I said, we look at them as the words rather than actions. How do you look at those? Is there the action that follows, and what are those relationships there?
Thank you, Patrick, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here with Fitri and Marietje, two very articulate spokespeople for the change we want to see in the digital world and in our common future. And I hope to learn from this particular engagement. I think what Fitri touched upon and what you are implying is very powerful. I think the digital world has missed a very important component that we are trying to fill through many of these conversations. Sharing of experiences and sharing of perspectives. I think innovation is outpacing social sciences today. Our social theories, the capacity of societies to absorb technology, the capacities of governments to create policies, the capacity of international institutions to build norms is far slower than the action that is happening in Silicon Valley, in Bangalore, in Indonesia, in Shanghai and other places. I think there is too much action and too little words. And I think we have to start rebalancing. We have to start talking about from action to words rather than from word to action. Technology is suffering from a lack of constructive discourse. I think our coders are smarter and our social scientists are not being able to keep up. So I think the challenge before us today is how do we build sensible policies for technologies that don't exist? I think that's the big challenge before us. Now, unless we have conversations, meaningful dialogues, and communities that engage with the grey rhinos and the black swans, we are not going to be able to build architecture for this. I think the first, which Fitri brought out cogently, I think you were alluding to as the second. I think in some ways, internet is the epitome of something we spoke about romantically, but never wanted to happen. We spoke about the idea of globalization at a hyper scale, and yet celebration of locality. We used to talk about it, localization. I think we gave it a term called globalization. Internet is hyper globalization. You are connected to each other across miles, and yet you are profoundly aware of tribal identities more than ever. I think in the last 10 years, we are more of our tribe than ever before, and we are more of global citizens than ever before at the same time. And I think this creates challenges around international conversations where seeding your identity becomes the first step towards creating something that everyone can own. So ceding sovereignty is the first step towards supra sovereignty. Case in point, the EU or ASEAN. All of us will have to leave a bit of ourselves behind to create something bigger than us. And internet, it's a paradox. It makes us want to cling on to our core, even as it allows us to embrace the world. And I think we have not yet got a fix on how do we deal with these centrifugal and centripetal forces that are pulling and pushing at the same time. And I think international arenas, the track 1.5s, the inter-community conversations, the dialogues on counter-radicalization or on positive speech, or the conversations around the role of platforms, governments, corporations, boardrooms, individuals, is all the more important, and in my view, still only scratching the surface in terms of intensity. We need far more intense collaboration of minds, of people, of communities than we have. And let me give you three things that we need more than ever before. One, I think the international conversations that I want to see happening in the next 10 years as we move to 2030, because Fitri mentioned the SDGs, and let's take that as a benchmark, that date. As we move to 2030, can we see more conversations happening in different languages? I think internet is still an English conversation, and the world is not necessarily evolving in that language. The world is growing in their own. And someone told me something curiously. They told me, just because Indians speak English, all of us think that we understand you. We don't. You speak English, but you don't think like English. Well, I said, thank God for that. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that I think the net has to be far more diverse in its components, in its constituency, in its design, in its evolution. And I think unless you go vernacular, we are still talking about a patriarchal, misogynist, white internet, which has allowed brown, black, yellow, and other people to participate, gender, etc., to come in excluded communities to join in to some extent. So I think the very fundamental of the net will have to change in the next 10 years if we need an inclusive net. Otherwise, we are going to be coding the biases of the past, and they're going to be far more rigid than ever. We are going to encode patriarchy. We are going to encode privileges in certain societies and communities. We're going to encode the winning formulas for certain folks while others are left out. So that's the first change I want to see. The second, I think we all have to realize that the internet cannot be managed by governments. And I know the pandemic has made the government seem to be all powerful. The citizens are depending more on their governments than ever before, and governments will have a temptation to grab this medium. They will have this temptation that let me regulate it. I will decide content. I will decide speech. I will decide what has to be shown on Netflix. I will decide what you consume and what you produce. And I think we have to resist this. And this is going to be the second biggest battle of this decade, that the governments that we had pushed back are back in our lives again. And we have to, over the next decade, start creating ways, international partnerships to ensure that multi-stakeholderism survives. I think the 10-year battle to build a concept of multi-stakeholderism was died with the coronavirus pandemic. And I think we have to revive it in some new form, in some new way, with some new energy, with some new vigor. Governments cannot manage this medium, and we will have to find communities that can. So that's the second big challenge. Who should be sitting on the table? Who all should be sitting on the table? And what should they be discussing? I think the governance table is today in shambles. We need to build it. And I think that's my second point, what we need to do over the next 10 years. And number three, we cannot give a free pass to boardrooms. I think the whole idea that technology for good should allow creators and innovators free passes is over. I think the collateral damage technology does is huge, immense. The rapidity, the velocity, the scale at which it can damage all of us is already visible to some of us. And I'm sure Mariche will speak about that. She has written eloquently about it. But if we want to prevent liberalism to die, we have to actually regulate the most liberal of everything we created, which was technology. I think unless you can find a new way of governing technology, technology will be Adam Smith's capitalism self-destructive, or to paraphrase him, liberalism finding its own way of decaying. So I think there has to be a new relationship with the boardroom. I have jokingly said, but I hesitatingly support the idea that we will have to move to a framework where boardrooms will have to be elected by communities they serve. You cannot have unelected, unaccountable boardrooms giving you the most important of services for your survival. Technology is no longer a privilege. As the pandemic has taught us, technology is life itself. Even in India, because we had the digital ID and the digital bank accounts, and some of them were able to tide over the crisis. Those who were excluded could not. Some who had access to certain content were able to respond to the crisis. Those who did not have access to that content suffered. So technology has far greater and graver consequences than we give it due credit for, and therefore the relationship with those who create technology must also be reframed in the coming decade. I think these are the three big things. Vernacular, that means plural tech, accountable tech, and tech owned by all. I think that's my three big things that I want to share with you.
Great, thank you, Samir. I think you have indeed given us a lot to think about, but it's also a great introduction to the conversation with Marietje, who, as you said, has written and spoken a lot about the relationship between tech and policy. But before we go to her, I found it quite interesting the observation you made about the representation gap that we're currently witnessing. When we talk about trust in cyberspace, can we really expect different actors to trust each other if so many of them actually cannot even communicate, as you said, in the language that they are closest to? And speak freely about the things that really concern them. So I think this representation gap is probably something that we indeed have to focus on when we talk about trust in digital means. I see certain evolution in your views. I might ask you about this later when it comes to the role of tech companies, because I remember very clearly a few years ago you were proposing this D20 format, which I found very interesting, whereby some of the big tech companies would be sitting around the table with states and taking decisions. I see a certain shift there, or maybe there is an evolution in terms of what that would imply and what that partnership and participation and sit around the table would imply for the tech companies. So actually, if you don't mind, maybe quickly clarifying, and then Marietje will come to you.
So I think it's an evolution of that old idea of mine that multi-stakeholderism will involve communities and societies, will involve corporations and enterprises, and will involve governments and international institutions. I think the idea of a D20 still remains alive in my mind. It only now places far greater direct burden of delivery on boardrooms. I think till now we have given them a free ride. They come and tell us all the nice things we want to hear, but they are not held accountable when things don't turn out that well. The politicians lose. They lose an election. They are kicked out. Government officers retire. Boardrooms make money. So I think the idea that you should be given just the mic and not the responsibility along with the mic is abhorrent, and that must be changed.
Great. And I'm sure, Marietje, this is the music to your ears, because I know that's one of the arguments you've been pushing forward. So I would be very curious to hear your reflections on that. But I would also I would like to go back to the second point that Samir made about that the governments cannot be the only actors deciding about how internet is governed. How do we reconcile on one side exactly this call, the governments have to withdraw? But at the same time, when we talk about, how we deal with tech companies and their behavior when it comes to the technology and cyberspace in general, we would actually like to see governments being involved in regulating more some of those aspects. And as a member of the European Parliament, the former one, I'm sure you were facing those dilemmas on a daily basis. Where do you draw the line? Where do you start regulating? Where you actually, give a free pass, as Samir was saying. So could you tell us something more about that? And another maybe question I will throw at you is the multi-stakeholder approach or multi-stakeholder model that Samir was talking about also relies to a big extent on the trust between different actors. And I think that's actually one of the currency that we do not really have in abundance, especially nowadays. So where do you see the possibilities for closing that gap in trust? Is it exactly through representation? I know you've also talked a lot about closing the accountability gap. Could that be also a mechanism to make sure that we find this comfortable spot for everybody participating in that conversation?
Great. Well, lots of questions, lots of things to talk about. Let me be brief and allow for some interaction as well, which I hope we can fit into this great session. So what I think first and foremost is that to build trust, there has to be a predictable and enabling environment, right? So far, Samir mentioned there's been a lot of lawlessness, a vacuum of regulations, and therefore also a vacuum of accountability. So I think policy should focus there on where principles are at stake in new ways in the digital world, and make sure that there's, for example, facilitation of, on the one hand, digital trade flows, but on the other hand, protection of rights. So it also helps to think about regulation, democratic regulation, as also an enabling condition, not only a restricting condition, which seems to be the tone that I hear a lot in, for example, Silicon Valley. So predictable norms and rules, but also consequences when rules are violated. I think that this accountability gap that you also referenced in the introduction is a problem, and it erodes trust, because people see illegitimate behavior or hear about crime or conflict between states, but never hear about the consequences attached. This in and of itself erodes trust in institutions, but also trust in the technology itself. So if you don't have trust to assume, then perhaps beginning to cooperate around shared interests is a good place. We should be reminded that more connectivity globally also means more mutual dependence, and we all lose, whether we're citizens, civil society, corporations, governments, when there's instability, when there's attacks, when there's a lack of respect for rights and freedoms, or a general erosion of trust and security as well. So currently, we may intuitively perceive certain behavior as illegitimate. For example, during the COVID pandemic, we've seen very cynical attacks on hospitals and health facilities, or we continue to see the export of weapon-grade hacking tools to societies where human rights are not respected, or we continue to be confronted with corporate espionage, just to name a couple of examples. And I think the problem is that while legal frameworks across borders to deal with this behavior is lacking, the trust and the very idea of justice applying in the digital world is losing foundation, and that's a problem. So now shifting to some good cyber stories, because I think that was the aim as well. I would like to highlight some initiatives, and obviously I could go on for 3 hours to mention more, but just a few to show that there are so many people working very hard to begin to address these problems. So I think civil society as a stakeholder deserves a huge shout out. The amount of work that's being done to, on the one hand, bring those that have not yet been connected to the internet online, but on the other hand, to prevent internet shutdowns like the Keep It On campaign by Access Now, are vital. I think any cooperative initiative between CERT or other technical experts should be welcomed. You mentioned in your introduction briefly the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Here we tried with different actors, technical experts, former government officials, people from the private sector, civil society representatives, academics, to come together and develop norms. I think this evolution of justice and accountability often begins with norms, to begin to see who might be willing to respect a certain standard, and then how this can be pushed onwards to anchoring those norms in more accountable mechanisms like regulation and law. So maybe I'll just add that I'm happy that the United Nations is stepping up its role through the digital roadmap. And I think there's a lot that can be done through this multilateral global forum, one of a few where all nations come together to look at responsible behavior, but also development. The SDGs were mentioned. I think it's crucial. But I hope that the UN will also have an eye on protecting the public interest and public values in light of this outsized role that the private sector plays, and the interpretation of how the UN Charter and other UN agreements should apply in the digital world, with the aim of mitigating harms, whether they're economic or in the security space or in the rights sphere. So to conclude, I think the one thing to look at critically is that in multi-stakeholder initiatives or in self-regulatory efforts, there always tends to be a self-selecting element. So the big challenge is, how do you bring those who are completely unwilling and who don't see a self-interest back at the table to also include them? secondly, I personally believe that while we can start with norms and agreements and statements and petitions, laws are eventually more powerful than norms or ethical standards. And in order for laws and more firm agreements and accountability to take hold, the digital needs to be understood as human. I mean, if people don't understand sufficiently how much it relates to their lives, their freedoms, their livelihoods, and their quality of life, then the political pressure for leaders to do more cannot be built up. And so I think that the third thing we need to do is to be realistic about the political nature of some of these debates. There is a difference in the starting point of, for example, values and culture that we come from. And for a long time, there's been this promise of an open internet that would almost, break through these very fundamental political differences. But I prefer to be honest and upfront about differences. And that would also allow us to go to a deeper level of understanding, for example, the role of government, which is often referenced. But there's a big difference between, let's say, an authoritarian-inspired governance model in government or a democratically accountable rule of law-based government. And so I think being upfront about where the differences in values and culture are and being clear about the fact that this is political and high stakes will begin to also facilitate perhaps not an easier, but at least a more open discussion about how we can overcome differences. And lastly, I'll say that I think a very powerful thing to remember is that democracies are multi-stakeholder processes. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to have more discussion, questions, etc.
Great, thank you very much. I really like the fact that you brought the element of honesty to the conversation as well as a sort of underpinning for building trust and having a really a conversation that can bring results. I think, as you said, rightfully, very often we actually start the conversations pretending that we're all on the same page, that we use the same vocabulary, and we pretend that we mean the same thing, but this is really hardly the case. And I think that's really the conversation to be had, especially in the context of the current international efforts that focus more and more on the implementation of the norms or CBMs or international law, where this exchanges about nitty-gritty details of what each of the concepts means are will really bring to the fore those differences that we have. You were extremely modest not mentioning one of the initiatives that the Cyber Peace Institute, for instance, has launched as we're dealing with the pandemics when it comes to countering disinformation around the healthcare system and attacks on hospitals. I think that's definitely one of the initiatives that we have to also highlight that has actually facilitated and made life easier for many of the medical services in different parts of the world. So kudos to you and the Cyber Peace Institute as well for taking that challenge. Fitri, I would like to bring you to the conversation on one of the aspects that Sami has kind of started talking about, but we didn't really dive into. As we think about 2030 or the next years, this conference specifically is taking place in a very peculiar context, global pandemics. Ideally, we would be, meeting in Paris and enjoying a glass of nice wine after the session. That is not possible. If you look ahead, what do you see as these particular challenges to peace and trust in cyberspace that you think international community needs to address as a matter of priority in order to better prepare for the next global crisis, wherever it might pop up?
Thank you for the question. I think, as Marta mentioned, I think we need to address, also you raised the issue of trust between actor and how we address to close this gap of trust and to make sure of the predictability of the Maricha proposed, whether there is a law or maybe in the Cyberspace International Convention. How realistic will we get there? When are we going to achieve that in a near future? That's a question. But I think baby steps that we can do is to improve or increase the capacity of the civil society to deal with misinformation and disinformation. I know the initiative that Mariche also mentioned before. Indonesia also have the Ministry of Information Technology that teams up with civil society, anti-hoax community, Mafindo, to crawl news and rumor, to do fact checking, announce truthfulness, and to be able to prevent, if we can, in a time sensitive manner, to prevent public disturbance or even riots. I think that is important to actually ensure what is truth in cyber. It's very difficult, and I think the homework as well to ensure to build infrastructure for those that having difficulty with internet connection where it is scarce, expensive, and especially fighting for where the connection is limited, close, and unsafe for people. I think we have to think for the people in this particular situation of disadvantages in conflict and post-conflict situation where peace negotiation may need to move online due to the limited face-to-face interaction, as well as to provide internet access to indigenous minorities, disability groups that enable to support their lives in this pandemic and other crises to come. I think that's for me.
Great, thank you. Marichi and Samir, I'd like to bring to the conversation some of the questions we're receiving through the chat, so please keep those coming. I have a question from Hanan El Arbi Saouli. How has digitalization affected the global economy, especially global companies? What are the solutions your country has adopted? Let's bring it also to maybe a global context. Do you think that some of the initiatives that we see popping up around the world, also including in the European Union, when we increasingly talk about digital sovereignty, for instance, and strategic autonomy, do you see those moves as something that potentially can help build trust between different actors? Or actually, do you see that those initiatives are one of the signs that the international community and actors do not actually trust each other, and everybody is out there looking out for their own interests? How can we actually bridge that divide again? Who wants to start?
Mariche, why don't you take that?
Okay.
So let me start by looping in the pandemic, which was the core of the question. And I think it has sort of exacerbated certain differences and inequalities that were already clear. The big beneficiaries, besides pharmaceutical companies, presumably soon, have so far been the tech companies, right? Because their services have now become vital lifelines to work, education, entertainment, news, friends, etc., culture. And so where there had already been concerns about the outsized power of corporations in the digital world, now we see a renewed political attention for, one, what does it mean to preserve the public interest? Two, how do you avoid that there is monopoly forming and abuse of corporate power? So I think antitrust, we even see China moving into this space now, and the US and the EU. It's a shared theme that is really, putting checks and oversight over the fair behavior in the economy of companies. But then we also touch upon where should boundaries be drawn in terms of protecting children, right, that are now accessing education through their screens, or how do we manage very sensitive information about people's health and make sure that it doesn't have mission creep? So, for example, you may need to record your health information in an app, but then how do you avoid that becoming a, for example, precondition to step on a flight or to take out an insurance or to enter into a store or what have you? So I think the question of power and responsibility has become evidence during the pandemic even more than it has before. And I would hope that it leads to a rebalancing of private power in the interest of public values, but also a different and renewed interpretation of how we are all mutually dependent. There's a shared human experience going on with this pandemic. There is a lot of lessons that could have been learned if there would have been more trust across countries. And so, yes, there had been some legitimate concerns about what the impact of globalization had been, but I think that the pandemic offers us a window into a new start of where we can better come together across the world. And to end with your last reference to the sovereignty and autonomy question that Europe is putting forward. I mean, I understand that the idea of not relying on others has been very clearly experienced, especially because of rifts in the transatlantic relation and trade wars that are going on and often sort of flying over Europeans. On the other hand, I do still see the European Union as the big actor when it comes to protecting and improving multilateralism. And I hope that the appeals for more autonomy, which I consider to be political, are not misunderstood in the rest of the world as, protectionist or nationalist tendencies, which I don't think they are, but I think there's a risk for misunderstanding there.
Great. So we will have Samir to tell us whether they're misunderstood or not, or how they're understood.
I to be honest, the reason
Sorry, I can just throw in one more question, actually, based on something that Margie has said. The argument, about the society shifting to digital sphere and a lot of activities actually, moving online. I also have the impression that this is a very much sort of Western conversation or developed world conversation. When I spoke to my colleagues in Africa and we were thinking about how do we rearrange some of our activities, can we move them online? A lot of them actually said, listen, forget it. It's not how we work. If there is no physical meeting, we do not really have the capacity to move online. So I'm just wondering whether, this idea of a security in cyberspace during the pandemic isn't just another first world problem, as we could call it. How do we approach that as well?
No, I think it's not a first world problem. It's a all of world problem. Mm-hmm. And all of us experience different sides of that problem. We experience it differently. It has differential impact on us. But the fact is that India was subjected to huge number of phishing attacks. There was cybercrime, which increased dramatically. There was frauds, there was hate, there was fake news. Everything that happened in Europe and the US also happened in India. It impacts different countries differently, but we are all impacted. Let's be very clear. So with 600 million of our citizens who are online, it is foolhardy to say that it doesn't matter to a country which still has a large chunk which is not online. Right. So the fact is that we still are a huge number of population that depend on the digital medium for conduct of our lives and livelihoods. So it impacts all of us differentially. The second, I think, but your point is right. I think it perhaps impacts the developing world in certain other ways. Now, if we were to suddenly move online much of our value generation activities, economic activities, what happens to the infrastructure challenges that were meant to be completed by 2030? We had planned that by 2030, we will bring everyone online, we will give everyone broadband, we will give everyone access to devices, we will give everyone access to their own personal interface. But the pandemic told us, let's do this in the next 3 months. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't do it. So you had parts of the emerging world which completely went online and were able to ride the tide, were able to make money, were able to create value, were able to create valuations. But there was a large part of the emerging world which was struggling, which was lost, which was helpless, which was on the roads. So the fact is that it's not simple. I don't think you can paint it through a single brush. What the pandemic did was it accelerated a 10-year project and compressed it to a 1-year timeline. And most of us failed to deliver. Let's be honest. You failed in different ways, we failed in different ways, but we all failed. We were not able to institutionally keep up with the demands of this particular rapid transformation that was required. So that's the first answer. The second is, I like the European sovereignty. I think Fortress EU had become so mercantilist in its approach to the world. It had withdrawn from geopolitics completely. I think the whole idea that they talk about sovereignty tells me that there is still hope. I was the one who said it, that any political idea that comes out of Europe is generally a bad one. I've said it multiple times. So digital sovereignty is perhaps the first good idea that has come out of Europe. So I appreciate, and guess what? I have said this in previous forums as well, that GDPR, as far as I am concerned, was the first political muscular policy pronounced by the EU. They said, screw you to the world, to the US, to the Chinese, to everyone else. If you want to play with my people's data, if you want to do business with me online, These are the terms of trade. These are the terms of engagement. It was a highly sovereign, super muscular proposition. And let's be honest about it. Now, the fact is that you put it out there and the world has responded to it, right? Now, I think if you are honest with, and that's the point Maritje was trying to make, if you are predictable and honest, you can be relied on. And I think the EU said, this is it. This is our policy. This is transparent. This is on paper. This is how it is going to be. You want to do business with me? Come into my domain. If you don't want to do business with me, I don't care. Right? Now, I think we are going to see more of these policies emerge, whether it is in the space of AI, whether it is in the space of supply chains, whether it is in the space of certain other technology infrastructure. We are going to see small groups come up with certain normative frameworks, and it is not going to be exclusive. This is not a anybody but China club. It is going to be a values, trust, interest-based framework where those who are willing to sign on to certain normative ideals can join the club. Those who don't like the club can stay out. Now, I think digital sovereignty, if it is seen in this light as a non-exclusive, interest-based, value-based proposition, is a good idea. As long as it allows everyone a fair and level playing field. Now, if digital sovereignty was to become perverse and was to become value capturing, that I am going to keep the value to myself and I'm going to share a little of it outside, then it becomes something that we must discard and people are going to reject it. GDPR was not rejected because GDPR was not one of those. And I'm hoping that European idea of digital sovereignty is going to still be the norm-setting role that it sees for itself. It is going to be more political in the future, hopefully, and hence it will have more skin in the game.
Samir, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time and I don't want to get the organizers angry as they have to prepare for the next session. I think what you have just done is prepared the ground for the next seminar or a webinar that we'll have to organize to continue this conversation. But I would like to thank you for joining us and the viewers for participating in this conversation as well. I hope that this session has inspired you to take concrete actions. Samir, Maritje, and Fitri have all given us concrete examples of areas and initiatives where we might think of concrete actions. Regarding the Good Cyber Stories initiative, I encourage you all to visit our website, the EU Cyber Direct project, where the detailed information about this initiative is displayed. And please stay tuned for the information as we are going to release it in the coming weeks about specific projects that have been selected for the pilot phase, including Mafindo that Fitri has already mentioned. In January 2021, we will launch an open call for applications under the theme Peace and Trust in Cyberspace. And we hope to hear about the good cyber stories that you are aware of, participating on, and implementing for your organization. So, Fitri, Samir, Maritje, thank you very much for joining me for this launch and the conversation. Enjoy the rest of the Paris Peace Forum, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.